Buenos dias, bom dia, and good morning. Hello all, and welcome to another DSM Aquaculture webinar. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you're always well from your side. Today, me and my colleague Eduardo Yamashita are pleased to host Dr. Dominique P in another webinar, bringing the topic, Aquafeed formulation in times of commodity price instability. To give you a short introduction from Dr. P, over the past 20 years, Dr. P nutritional studies include nutrient requirements and utilization for different fish species, the development of cost-effective feed formulation, the evaluation of nutritive value of the economical feedstuffs, and the management of environmental impacts of aquaculture operations, together with the development of mathematical models of growth, nutrient utilization for fish and shrimp. Dr. P also lead and create the development of the International Aquaculture Feed Formulation Database with the support of the United States Soy Export Council, USEC, which sets out the nutritional needs for the main aquaculture species at different life stages. Before starting, I would like to remind you that you can ask questions during the event, typing the text in the question box and clicking the button next to it. Your question will be answered at the end of the presentation. Well, starting our conversation, Dr. P, thank you very much for accepting this invitation, and please be welcome to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiago. It's a pleasure to be able to join you for a second time with these DSM webinar. So today I'll talk about aquaculture feed formulation, mostly with a focus on feed ingredients and how to deal with this in certain times, both on the logistics side and also fluctuation of price of feed ingredients. So I'll try to provide you some of my thought on this. I interact in my career with many feed manufacturers and many feed formulators and nutritionists, and I know it's a very difficult job and very difficult position, especially I would say in Latin America, Central America. You are producing feed for different aquaculture species, from salmon to shrimp to everything in between, all the omnivorous fish species and carnivorous fish species that are produced in the different countries. But it's not just the difference in species, you have different life stages. You have to formulate feed with animals that are very small and animals that are very big. Different markets within Latin America will have different needs. Different grades of feed will be demanded by farmers. Some corporations can afford very expensive feed, whereas smaller farmers with not very large financial means will prefer much cheaper feed, lower quality feed, and try to make do of this. As feed manufacturer, feed formulators, nutritionists, you have to control your production costs. You have very low profit margin. It is not a business where you're actually making a lot of money per kilogram of feed that you're feeding. So controlling costs is everything in that business. But at the same time, you have to manage the risk for your corporation and for your clients. If you do something that is too risky, you endanger your corporation because the profit margin is very small. But you can also endanger your client because if you provide them with feed that are not adequate, that have a problem, then you can endanger their livelihood. So it's a very difficult balancing act, try to minimize the cost, but at the same time, minimizing the risk. Now you have to do this in a very challenging environment. You have different production system, different socio-economical condition, and you have clients that have different problems. Disease, product quality, market access restrictions, access this. You have to formulate the feed using ingredients, and these ingredients are costly. Some are less costly, some are more costly. The price is variable. The supply can be variable, especially this time of pandemic where global supply chain can be affected. And these ingredients are not perfect. When the ingredient is perfect, then it's very expensive. So the name of the game is trying to work with imperfect ingredients, understand these ingredients, so therefore you can make the best job you can out of what you're provided with. This within a context that you have limited time. There's only 24 hours in a day, and you have limited budget, limited personnel, You can dream about having a big R&D team and a big R&D center and stuff, but it's probably not realistic to expect that. And you have limited amount of time. You have a problem, you have a situation, well, things have to be addressed right away. You cannot just wait several months to get the results from research. So how do you approach these challenges? How do you make successful, cost-effective feed within this environment is a real challenge. So the goal of my presentation is to provide you with practical strategy at a high level, how to formulate cost-effective aquaculture feed, successful or good aquaculture feed in this context of instability of price and supply of major agricultural commodity. I put a little cartoon there. I like to be kind of provide you advice, but also the pro and the con of things. I will be acting both as guardian angel and devil advocate, this cartoon shows, to show you you could do this, but the other flip coin of that may be increased risk for this or that. So I'll try to provide you some insight of this in this presentation. Now, in the first presentation that I made a few months ago, I say, well, the way for us nutritionists, feed formulators, feed manufacturers to address the challenges is through dietary strategy. We cannot just change the whole world. We cannot change the way farm operates. So the only thing we can do is play with the diet, play with the feed that we're producing. And there's different ways of doing this. First, you can play with the feed formulation. You can change your nutritional specs or the way you formulate the feed. Second is you can say, well, I'm going to start relying on different ingredients, but that means characterizing a wide variety of ingredients. Or in the end, you say, well, I have what I have, the ingredients that I have, the equipment that I have, the condition that I have. I will try to make more of these ingredients, more of this formulation through the use of different nutritional solutions or feed additive, including enzymes, micronutrients or sources of micronutrients or conditioning essential nutrients that as you replace fish meal, for example. You may deal with a mixture that are not so perfect and not so tasty for the animals. So you may try to enhance the palatability. And then you may have some health implications. So you may try to use solutions to promote the health, the disease resistance, stress resistance of the animal. So I'll try to cover some of those, not all, but some of those in my presentation. In terms of feed formulation strategy, my view is there's a million different ways of producing 1 kilogram of fish. There's no single straight solution to producing 1 kilogram of fish. It's not like, even in the poultry industry, it's also the case, but it's more stable. But in aquaculture, really, I have the feeling that you can formulate feed to different specs with different ingredient mixture and still be able to produce fish. The animal will still be performing quite okay. Maybe not perfectly, but it'll be still performing quite okay with a wide variety of feed that are formulated to different specs. And that's one characteristic of aquaculture, is that this variability in composition. Many years ago, somebody says, well, what is a typical trout feed? And I asked him, well, what do you mean? He says, well, what is everybody using in terms of trout feed? I said, well, it doesn't exist. Depends on the country you see, depends on things. You can have a 36% crude protein trout feed, and you can have a 50% crude protein trout feed. You can have a 15% fat trout feed, and you can have a 30% fat trout feed. So it really depends on the market. So there's no single solution. So you have to keep an open mind when you formulate a feed. It says, well, there's no a single solution. There are many solutions to this. And what is acceptable in terms of nutritional specification is a function, of course, of the species of animal, their metabolic capacity, their size. You don't formulate the same way. You don't have the same leeway in a very small animals versus a larger animal. You may have more leeway in that larger animal. Depends on your production system. Are you super intensive or semi-intensive? Well, a semi-intensive system will be a lot more forgiving than a super intensive system where you're in a RAS, environment where feed quality is not only affecting the animal, it's also affecting your production system. So your intensity of production, the type of production system you're using, is key in determining what is acceptable in terms of feed formulation that you can use. And then there's the whole socioeconomical context where you say, well, you have a farmer that can't afford to purchase very expensive feed, invest or it is, and other farmers that cannot afford more than a few dollars, right, for their feed purchase. So therefore, feed formulation can be variable depending on feed. I realized this many years ago. We started doing research on trout and salmon, and we would play the nutritional density and achieve very similar growth. And it did the same thing, the same work in Indonesia with cage farm of tilapia. That was about 10 years ago. And we used a different feed that were manufactured by the company. They had different feed grade, which they were expressing protein content, but the nutritional composition changed between the feeds. And you can see that the top 3 feeds there, at the top of there, gave equal growth performance under the condition in which the tilapia were reared in that environment. The difference between the feed was not in terms of growth rate, it was in terms of FCR. You needed more of a lower quality feed than of a higher quality feed. Now there was a limit to the degrading of the feed quality. If you fed a very poor quality feed, the fish could not keep up and your FCR was go even further. But there was a bracket of composition where the animal could still express their potential under the condition that with this. So these performances were not all that good. These farms were not all that good because the water quality in that lake where they're producing was not very high. So in this specific case, it didn't really matter the type of feed you're using, but there was difference in FCR. Now, the feed of different quality have different price. So there was an increase in the price of the feed with increasing quality. But then there was also a decreasing FCR with increasing in quality. So in the end, you have to take into account both the feed price and the FCR to calculate a cost of feeding, a number of dollars per fish produced. And in this specific scenario, for these farms, in that case, it did not matter economically speaking whether you were using the lower end feed or the higher end feed. The production cost was very stable. The feed cost was very stable, and overall the production cost was very stable across these feeds. So let's say you arrive with a condition where high protein ingredients are extremely expensive. Lower protein ingredients become are a lot more affordable. There's more like the price differential. Well, you can potentially reduce the nutritional specs of your feed, right? You will expect higher FCR, but your cost of feed could decrease. And in some scenario, that might be a win-win situation. In other case, actually, if you're, for example, operating in a research system or you're under very high density condition and your water quality can deteriorate rapidly with the waste, well, your feed quality is not just the amount of feed that you're feeding and the cost, it's also the amount of waste that are produced. And a lower quality feed will result in more solid waste, solid organic waste, which will limit your production. In the case of shrimp, it may actually be stimulating the growth of pathogenic bacteria and affecting the, increasing the disease, the incidence of disease and increased mortality in the population. So you have to factor all this. You cannot simply just look at the price of feed per kg. You have to factor in the FCR. And in some case, you have to factor in the waste output. So there's no single solution. So in this specific case, because of conditions, it was a very polluted environment and it didn't really matter. Nobody really mattered. Well, the farmer says, well, I could be buying more expensive feed, but I could be buying a more cheaper feed. And in this case, say, for them, it made more sense to buy the cheaper feed because it was less risk for them. In the case, in terms of production costs, it didn't make any difference for these farmers. And if something went wrong, buying a cheaper feed made more sense for them because they had less risk in this case. But as you increase your density, your production density, or as you increase growth performance, a higher quality feed was really quite the solution. So you see, there's no single solution or perfect solution to this answer, and you have to be open-minded in your approach. Now, seeing something similar with trout feed, where local feed manufacturer or farmers are seeing, well, the big guys providing trout feed or salmon feed are charging us a lot for the feed, and we have local feed manufacturer that can make something cheaper for us. So, but these local feed manufacturers don't have the capability of the larger one to produce higher fat feed and higher digestibility feed stuff. But this local home feed manufacturer could produce a 45% crude protein feed, 15% lipids, but they had to use quite a bit of starch. They were actually initially a pet food manufacturer, so they actually had to use quite a bit of starch to make the pellet property using their system. And the fish were doing quite well, but when you open up the fish, then you could see the liver was very pale, lots of fat accumulated around the gut. So that's an indication there's too much carbohydrate in the feed. The feed was not of high enough quality. Now, it doesn't really matter in most cases. Under perfect condition, this situation, when you're harvesting the fish, it doesn't really matter. But under certain condition, that can have negative consequence. And I saw this close to 20 years ago in Kentucky, and then after that in Guangzhou, in Guangdong province in China with largemouth bass. The exact same problem happened in Kentucky, US, and in China, where they were actually feeding extruded feed. The story is that they started with steam pelleted feed, and then the companies bought extruder, but they did not adjust their feed formulation. So all of a sudden, the digestible starch content of the feed went double overnight. And during the summer season and the fall season, they didn't have any problem with the fish. But then they had an especially cold winter in these two places at different years. And the fish started dying. And when they opened up the fish, they found that this fish that had big livers were having problem resisting winter. They had things that basically their liver would die and would become hypoxic. The liver was too big. The circulation of the blood to the liver was not good enough in some part, and the part of the liver would die. And in the fish that survived the winter, they would open it up and they would find like tissue, dead tissue, and then healthy liver growing again. So these animals, some of these animals were able to recover. So there's a limit to which you can decrease the quality of the feed and not have a certain consequence. If you're operating under perfect conditions, stable water temperature, no pollution, no stress, and high level of oxygen, the animals is probably able to do okay with those. But under challenging conditions, then that can create problems. So that you can increase your risk factor. So there's only so much you can change and not have any risk. Now there's also an issue of species. I showed you the largemouth bass and rainbow trout are carnivorous fish species, and their ability to use lower quality feed is probably a lot less than other species. So we did this experiment comparing Nile tilapia and rainbow trout, and we looked at the effect of mycotoxins in this case, but we wanted to know if the animals were able to resist mycotoxin with more or less carbohydrate in their diet, was our question. But a side result of this experiment is we're able to compare a carnivorous fish species, rainbow trout, versus an omnivorous fish species, Nile tilapia, at two different sizes, because we followed them over a few weeks. And basically, the take-home message is that when the animals are small, when a tilapia and a rainbow trout are less than, let's say, 25, less than 50 grams, they're identical in terms of metabolism. They don't use carbohydrate very well. But when the tilapia gets bigger, it becomes a lot better than rainbow trout at utilizing carbohydrate. And 24% starch was great for these tilapia. 25% starch was great, whereas it was very deleterious for the rainbow trout. It was limiting performance. It was actually resulting in very bad FCR. So there's difference in species, but also difference in life stage into which this. So tilapia, more forgiving. If they're bigger than 50 or 100 grams, you can have more leeway. But in small fish feed, I would say in starter, pre-starter, starter feed, don't play with fire. Even if the price of the ingredients is expensive, keep the quality of these feeds and then focus your saving on the larger fish feed. And that's the other aspect. Says, well, if you refer to the NRC, and that was only NRC, there's one value reported for tilapia, one value reported for salmon and trout and all these species. But we're producing, right, a trout that we're raising. We're start first feeding at 250 milligrams and then grow them to, right, 2 kilograms. Well, right, a salmon up to 5-6 kilograms. Well, the nutritional requirement, at least the nutritional specification for these feeds for different size of animal should be different. But the NRC only has one value. Now, if you refer to one value, in most cases, you will have an excess compared to the requirement. Even the NRC can be deficient at some point in time for a very, very small fish. But in most cases, if you refer to one value required by the NRC, in some case, you will have excess compared to the requirement. Every nutrient will be different. Phosphorus will respond in a different way than lysine. Lysine requirement will not change that much with size, whereas phosphorus, because it's a mineral, indestructible, it becomes more diluted in the feed, and you can actually have lower level. The only way that I know, you cannot really study this experimentally because it's very costly. The only way that I know to be able to make rational prediction of how you should change the feed with size of the animal is to do through modeling, through mathematical modeling. And we developed this model for phosphorus example. And comparing to real data from the real world, it seems to be working. So the model seems to be yielding realistic results. So I really encourage you to start thinking about how you could use systematic approach like modeling to be able to make business decision, how to what level should be formulating my feed according to size of the animal, production system, and the like. Now, in terms of ingredient replacement in feed formulation, there's also different feed formulation strategies. And I realized this working in China. It's about 15 years ago with my colleague Wang Yan from Shanghai University, and he moved to Zhejiang. And Wang Yan is a very practical man, and he basically bought his own cage farm in South China to be able to do his experiments under controlled conditions, but farm-like conditions. So we did together a series of studies on different marine fish species that I think were really interesting. And it's all the credit to Wang Yan because he has a different way of thinking. He says, well, we're trying to replace fish meal, expensive fish meal, with, in this case, we were funded by the Fats and Protein Research Foundation from the US, and he was testing different mixture of animal protein, meat and bone meal, poultry byproduct meal, blood meal, feta meal. He would make a mix out of them and try to replace fish meal with that mix of this. And what he found is that if he formulated to a low protein feed, 35% digestible protein, the performance of the fish would drop at low level of replacement. He could not use more than a certain amount of his protein mix. But if he actually formulated his feed to slightly higher protein level, 40% digestible protein, then he could replace a lot more, and he could formulate down to 8% fish meal. So in the low protein feed, he had to formulate to 28% or about 28% fish meal, and in a higher protein feed, he could replace much more fish meal and all this. So that made me realize, it says, well, we think about fish meal replacement and feed formulation, but really the animal is after nutrients. And if you're actually replacing a good quality ingredient with a lower quality ingredients, expected lower quality ingredients, what you should be focusing is on the nutrient level. And there's no formulation trick like this. You can increase your protein level and actually, focus on meeting the essential amino acid requirements as a percent of diet. Now you may say, well, but the requirement may be the function of the balance of amino acid, the ratio of this. Well, actually, from my perspective, from what I've seen, it doesn't really matter. The animal is able to accommodate itself with excess of certain amino acids, as long as you don't do something too crazy. Like if you use only feather meal, very high level of poor quality feather meal, yeah, the performance is going to crash. But if you're using a decent mixture of ingredients to replace your fish meal, well, if you run into a problem with the formulation, just bump up your protein a little bit. Let the protein rise up. And I see this training feed formulators through a workshop that people have restriction, have come limitation this. They say they will put a maximum to the protein they can formulate. And they say, no, if the program tell you, you should be raising your protein by 5%, so be it. Just let it rise and see what it does. So one of the trick in feed formulation is just leave your specs, the upper limit of your specs open, and see what your feed formulation will give you, and often it will be the solution to some of your problems. So you can see this was a highly carnivorous marine fish species, and we were able to formulate with less than 8% fish meal. And I've seen this in recent weeks, even in Vietnam, for example, they're formulating these feed to steakhead and Kobe and all this, and they're formulating down to 7 or 8% fish meal now because they've realized to say, well, the important is to meet the digestible amino acid requirements of the animal. So this the balance or something, and we have more leeway. So just these small trick and even small experiments. You don't need very fancy statistical design in order to address that. Now, there's limits. I work in Indonesia with African catfish in this case. I use this for my master's degree also. So I say, well, we know now nutrient requirements, so we're going to formulate feeds. We let the feed formulation program decide what it wants to do. And we formulated a commercial. We had a commercial recipe that was successful. And then we left saying, well, let's just let the feed formulation program decide what would be successful. Just impose very few limits. There's lots of animal proteins in there, so should meet all nutrients. Well, it did not work. In the end, the fish were somewhere at 20-25% lower weight than the fish fed the fish meal feed. The FCR was actually quite similar on an animal basis. So it's probably a question of palatability, or something was missing in the feed and the animal just lost the interest in feeding more, so it was limiting the performance. It was not dramatic. We could still produce decent quality fish and have decent yield, but we couldn't get all the growth potential out of these animals. So you have to be careful. You have to limit your and impose some restriction in your feed formulation. Not what it is. Now, when I look at this, often we think about feed formulation about a mix of ingredients, and that's what it is. But that mix of ingredients is meeting certain nutritional specifications, certain requirements. So dealing with feed formulators, I often see that we end up formulating on an ingredient basis. I want 10% fish meal. I want maximum 30% soy. I want minimum 10% whatever, right? All this. So often in our mindset, we become ingredient driven in our feed formulation. But we have to realize that, right, that ingredients themselves don't mean a whole lot, right? We're buying soybean meal and meat and bone meal and poultry meal and all this. We're buying them sometime on a crude protein basis or crude fat basis, something like this. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because these ingredients are variable. Poultry byproduct meal is not poultry byproduct meal. Meat and bone meal is not meat and bone meal. Blood meal is not blood meal. I've worked with these products, and every batch and every supplier uses a slightly different processing technique, and the quality will be different. The chemical composition will be different, and the digestibility can be different. So we should not be looking at ingredients per se. We should be looking at nutrients. The animal actually does not use ingredients. It uses ingredients that contain nutrients or are sources of nutrients. So what matters is the nutritional requirements of the animal, what nutritional specification you should be formulating the feed to. And I covered this a little bit, and in the previous seminar was the major focus of this. But the next one should be the focusing on the characteristics of the ingredients being source of nutrients. So you should be looking at the cost, availability of these ingredients, but not just the cost, right, per weight, but the cost effectiveness. If you have an ingredient that contains more protein and fat than another one, well, it would be worth more than the previous one. You have to focus on the nutrient content and how variable it is. So 10% fish meal may mean very different things if it's a South American anchovy meal from Peru versus a Southeast Asian fish meal, which is fish byproduct, all kinds of fish species mixed together. So we have to be very careful about that. Now, if the nutrients are not digestible, and I'll get to this later on, and not bioavailable, this is of no value to the animal. So you can have high level of lysine, but if that lysine is not available, it's of no use to the animal. And then there's all kinds of limitations that are difficult to characterize, but are important associated with the ingredient. Contaminant, anti-nutritional factors, impact on physical property of the feed that you're making, impact on final product quality of the feed of the fish that you're producing. So you have to take this into consideration. And all of those have a chemical basis. So the more we understand our ingredients, the more we can be wise about our selection of ingredients and how much to use of the specific ingredient batch that we have. So nutrition and feed formulation is not just a question of making a recipe, right? It's about really a scientific process, or at least it should become a more scientific process. Your nutrients, like I mentioned, this is a source of nutrients that are going to be required. So they're critically important in the feed formulation process. Now, if you want to produce cost-effective feed using these cost feed formulations, what the program will be looking for is cost-effective source of nutrient, the cheapest source of nutrient of that specific nutrients among the mix of ingredients that you're providing the program with. You're providing all this. So really identifying the most cost-effective ingredients is really critical. Now you can do this through price shadowing. You can run example in feed formulation and identify which one did, but that can be quite tedious. So we've developed kind of a different approach for this. We'll get to this. Now, the ingredients is source of nutrients. So understanding your ingredients, characterizing the nutritional composition of your feed ingredients, to me is really key. Among those, you can measure crude protein and amino acids quite well, so you can do it before you make your feed. But measuring digestibility and bioavailability of nutrients is a very different thing, and it's a lot more time consuming, a lot more risky and prone to error. So actually, but this is what matters. So we need to invest more effort in identifying better ways of estimating digestibility and bioavailability of nutrients. And then we have to characterize and understand the limitation and logistical constraint associated with each ingredient, which is really quite an art form in this case, because every ingredient, every manufacturing system, every condition can have an impact on your decision. Now going back to the price, many years ago I started doing these kind of analyses as well. We have different feed ingredients with different price, but to compare them on a price basis doesn't make a whole lot of sense because these ingredients have different protein content. So I started comparing the price of protein-rich ingredients like fish meal, canola meal, corn gluten meal, soybean meal, and all this on a protein basis. But I'm saying if digestible protein is what matters, well, we should be computing the value per unit of digestible protein. So through this process, I was able to identify that which ingredients are too expensive, more expensive, and which ingredients are less expensive on a standardized basis. So I found it pretty useful. And in this, you identify the good deals, right? So in this case, DGGS in this case was really good deal. Fatter meal was a really good deal. Corn gluten meal was a good deal. Red canola meal, that specific case, was not so good deal. In that case, that specific year, 2013, soybean meal was a bit less good deal compared to the other ingredient. So you can do these simple calculations. Take the price list and then look at the nutrient composition and divide the value by the nutrient composition. This, however, is imperfect because fish meal is not just a source of protein. It's a source of lipids, there's some residual lipids, it's a source of EPA, DHA, which is expensive. It's a source of phosphorus, which is expensive. So you should be actually computing the value not just on the basis of protein, but also on the basis of other useful nutrients that can be expensive. So that's where we started with my company, with Aqua, starting developing tools like this that integrates this knowledge. We developed what we call an economical valuation tool. Now, just quickly show you this. So it's a tool that relates the price of commodities with their chemical composition and certain attributes. So therefore, we're trying to find a fair market price for ingredients on the basis of their nutritional composition, and then look at what the market values. What is it? Does it give a premium to marine product? Does it give a negative price to animal proteins or something like this? We find this a little bit more wholesome and practical than price shadowing, because price shadowing, you have to have formulation, you have to have a feed formulation program. This allows you to look at the market as a whole, the nutritional composition and the attribute as a whole, and then be able to determine what are good deals on the market and not so good deals in the market. So it can be a pretty good tool for feed procurement or feed ingredient procurement department. So we developed this tool. So far we have 14 countries, including many in Latin America, including Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. So we are covering many of the important countries in terms of aquaculture production. We built in database with lots of nutritional parameters and attributes for all these ingredients for these different countries with the price. And this is the outcome. This is the output of our program. It may be a little bit small here, but you can see here we have the price of different feed ingredients, their market price, and then our program computes two values. A value based on simply nutritional composition of the ingredients. So based on the average cost of protein, EPA, DHA, lipids, phosphorus, etc., this is how much the ingredient is worth. Now, we try to reconcile with the market, and it says, well, the market seems to be valuing different things, so we correct this for what the market value thinks. So in this case, if it's a marine protein, it gets a very big bonus of $600 per ton of a high-quality fish meal, in this case. So above and beyond the nutritional value, the fish meal gets a big premium, right? Other ingredients actually do not get that premium and often get a discount. So let's say in vegetable protein, animal protein, they get a discount. The market view them as less good source of these nutrients, so therefore give them a penalty. Well, this way you can identify which one are the good deal and the bad deal. So the red one is bad deal, so they're fish meal in this case, or everything. And the green one are actually good deal. They give you, when you buy them, you get more nutrients, right, for the value than the market value. So simple systematic way here that takes into account not just protein, but fat, phosphorus, EPA, DHA, starch, and other nutrients like this, methionine, lysine, and all this, which are costly, all this. So we're developing these tools, making it better all the time. We're improving the statistical model to make it a useful tool for the industry. In the end, right, you have to understand your ingredients. Like I mentioned, fish meal is not fish meal, poultry byproduct meal is not poultry byproduct meal. Every batch of ingredients is different. Every supplier is different. So you have to understand what you're purchasing. So we have to get out from the mindset, say, I need 10% fish meal, and then focus on the specific composition of that fish meal, how much nutrients that fish meal is bringing, how much nutrients that soybean meal is bringing. It's a lot more meaningful than simply looking at it as percent or feed ingredient driven formulation. Now, that ingredient in itself, you can analyze it and you can find two soybean meal with 46 or 47% crude protein. But if you look more closely, there is some variation in the amino acid composition of that crude protein. It's not because a soybean has 46% crude protein that it will have the same level of lysine. So two soybean can have the same protein level, but may have different level of lysine. There is variability in the chemical composition of that protein. And it's something that we don't always realize. So if you're using 10% or 20% of a certain soybean and you're replacing it with a cheaper one, well, on the crude protein basis, it may not have any impact, but on a nutrient basis, it may have impact. So you really have to go more deeper in your characterization. You cannot simply limit yourself to proximate analyses. There's a number of surveys that have been carried out, and there's a nice paper, a nice meta-analysis paper of soybean that was published recently. And you can see from these data that for the different amino acids, there's quite a bit of variability of amino acids at the same level of crude protein. You can see quite a bit of variation for some of the amino acids that are quite variable. Of course, as you increase protein, the amino acids will go up because protein is made of amino acids. But the makeup of that protein may change. So it's important to go down to the amino acid profile of the ingredients and focus on meeting amino acid requirement. Apologies. Right? Now, this total nutrient content, but you also have to worry about the digestible nutrient content. And an ingredient can have the same name. In this case, I realized this more than 25 years ago when I did research on blood meal. You can buy different kinds of blood meal, but they're going to be processed differently. The ingredients that is perhaps the most dramatic in the variation in the processing technique used to produce it. If you buy a blood meal and a spray-dried blood meal, in general, it's completely digestible. 95 to 99% digestible in spray-dried blood product. Use ring dry, right, will be fairly high digestibility, but significantly lower than spray-dry. If you use other one, rotoplate dry, steam tube dry, it really depends on the supplier. And you can have decent quality product, digestibility between 80 to 90%. And sometimes you'll get very poor quality product, digestibility down in the 15, 20%. And I've seen this even in Latin America and all this. So you really have to be worried about this. So if you're buying blood meal, really it's really important to know that quality of that meal, how it is produced, but even the name of the drying system may not tell you a whole lot about the digestibility, except when you're dealing with spray dry, which is in general always very, very high quality because of such a very gentle drying process. So you cannot simply look at the name of ingredients, you really have to understand that ingredient. Well, similar things is happening with plant protein. In this case, you have rapeseed meal with a canola, and that's done by Adiseo in Europe. And they sample different crushing canola meal or rapeseed meal from different crushing plant, and they found that lysine digestibility of the canola meal, very similar grade, there was a little bit of variation in crude protein content, but not that much, were actually different between crushing plant. There were crushing plant that were doing very good, preserving the quality of the product, and the crushing plant that were doing a poor job and resulting in significantly lower digestibility of the product. So processing is everything in a manufacturing ingredient. Thermal processing is really quite key, and we have to worry about this. And it's not because you're buying a canola meal that it's going to be of consistent quality across country, across supplier, even across season. There will be some variability, and that can cause some issue. Overeating of plant protein or animal protein will cause a reduction in the digestibility and bioavailability of nutrients. This has been demonstrated experimentally, but also in practice, like I showed you in a previous slide. If you overheat soybean meal, you will have a reduction in the digestibility and in a reduction in the performance of the animal. So heat treatment is essential in the production of these ingredients, both plant and animal protein ingredients. They're key because you need to kill anti-nutritional factors, stabilize the product, reduce the volume, reduce bacteria and all this. But it's a double-edged sword. You have to find the right amount of heat treatment in order to not damage the nutrients. You have to use heat treatment to address the challenge that you have, but you have to limit this heat treatment not to damage the ingredient. And that's the main determinant of ingredient quality. Over the years, I've realized this. The main determinant of ingredient quality is not the origin, it's not the cultivars and stuff like that. It's very often what happened, how you process these ingredients at the plant, at the feed not the feed manufacturing plant, but the ingredient plant. And you as feed manufacturer don't have any control on this. You don't decide how the soybean meal is crushed, how the soybean is crushed, how the canola is crushed and processed. You don't decide this. But what you can do is identify better quality suppliers and lower quality suppliers and differentiate with them and apply different risk factors to these different suppliers. Use tighter margin, more restricted margin if you're dealing with a supplier that you don't trust completely, where you can be more comfortable using higher level of an ingredient that is produced by a supplier that knows is providing a high quality, highly consistent product. So knowing this. Now we've done a bunch of survey on the digestibility of plant protein, and overall we find very high digestibility, except for some example. Sometime we'll find, for example, in this case, a sunflower meal produced in the U.S. using a speller plant that was of poor quality, whereas a sunflower meal produced in Bolivia, for example, or in Central Europe was a very, very high quality. This. Same thing on the canola rapeseed, right? We can assume the digestibility of canola is very low in some cases, at least in the literature, but we found very high digestibility of canola product and things. And in this case, in this specific case, this was a product that was actually produced on a pilot scale basis, and they were trying to increase the protein content, the product quality, and in the end they started killing the protein by processing, trying to make the product better. They ended up making the product less good. The digestibility was going down because they had too much processing. They had to dry a second time and the like, and that was creating a problem. So my take-home message is that actually there's good quality out there, but there's sometimes problem of ingredient quality that you have to identify. In this case, these plant protein, in South America and Latin America, sunflower meal, at least in Chile, is better known. In North America and even in Asia, sunflower meal is not very well known, but it's a terrific resources, and we found excellent product. So if the price is right, I have no problem recommending the use of a sunflower or rapeseed meal in feed. Now, even your standard ingredients can have variable digestibility. In this case, many years ago, we carried out research on corn gluten meal, and we're measuring digestibility of over 90%. 95% was very common when we measured the digestibility of corn gluten meal. Wheat gluten is always highly digestible, always in the order of 95 to 99%. It's a good quality product. But then a few years ago, we started seeing problem with our feed formulated with corn gluten meal. We had some problem, and we examined the digestibility, and all of a sudden the digestibility of corn gluten meal dropped by 5 or 6%. So don't think your ingredient quality is going to be stable all the time. That was basically the same supplier, but perhaps they changed things, because sometimes these products are byproduct from manufacturing. The corn gluten meal producer, actually they're producing high fructose corn syrup. They're not really interested in the corn gluten meal, it's a side of their business. They're interested in producing that human food grade product, and the rest is byproduct. So they don't always think about the quality of the ingredients when they make change in their manufacturing plant. So you have to be aware of changes that happens at your supplier. And that had significant impact on the performance of the animal. So we compare the performance of fish fed the wheat gluten versus the corn gluten meal, response to lysine, and even at deficient lysine level, as we're increasing level, we had much better response with wheat gluten than we had with corn gluten meal because of this problem of quality of the feed ingredients, of the general protein of that ingredient. So be careful, even though you have say, well, I have good success with that ingredient can change. Characterizing that ingredient is pretty important. My colleague in Guelph measured the digestibility of key amino acids in swine, and they compare the quality, and you do find difference in amino acid digestibility between plant protein. Soybean meal is the reference. In general, U.S. soybean meal is the higher digestibility product. Canola will be significantly lower digestibility, but not too far behind. Corn DGTS depend very much how it's produced, the quality of the product, but in general will be a little bit lower than soybean and canola. And look at the wheat shorts, right? It can be highly variable. So at least these even wheat gluten is very highly digestible. Wheat shorts and other byproducts can be of variable and lower quality, and you have to be careful about this. So when you have a milling byproduct that is variable and coming from different place, you have to be a little bit worried about this because the digestibility can be variable. And I realized this many years ago in Indonesia, where we're getting poor quality, poor results with certain types of feed. For some reason, we didn't quite understand, but the farmers were complaining about the quality of feed. So we started measuring the digestibility of commercial diet, a real diet, and tried to this. It was not a specific experiment to look at the digestibility of individual ingredients. We looked at the digestibility of diets, and what we found through mathematics is that we were able to identify the digestibility of the different components. Using a simple mathematical trick, kind of a iteration, we're able to determine, in this case, the digestible energy content of different feed ingredients. And we realized that one of the ingredients that we were using, wheat bran pellet, that was coming from Ukraine. So they were using wheat bran and pelleting it at very high temperature to reduce the volume so they could pack more within a container, actually had very bad impact on the digestibility, and that product very, very poor. So the product was good price, but in the end was causing problem. And we didn't need a very fancy experiments. We did one digestibility trial, but we used commercial feeds, and we were able, because we knew the composition of the feed, to estimate the digestibility of different ingredients. My colleague in Guelph also worked on these wheat byproducts and all this, and they formulate diets that were equal in digestible nutrient content. They did very careful work to measure the digestibility, and they formulated a feed with different digestible nutrient level, and they actually found that in this case of the wheat byproduct, they had much lower performance than the standard ingredients they were using in their thing. So even though the digestibility was very high, the bioavailability of amino acids in these ingredients was not very high. Why? How can something be digestible and not bioavailable? Well, I have this hypothesis that it may be related to cross-links within the protein, knots as you wish, within the protein. You create these knots, a bit like knots within a shoelace, and these knots interfere with protease activity. So when you digest that protein, you don't end up with a very nice smooth mixture of amino acids and dipeptide and tripeptide, but you end up with the mixture of dipeptide, tripeptide, but also relatively big polypeptide that are soluble, that you measure as digestible, and are not, maybe not this, because digestibility is a measure of disappearance. It was in the feed, it was not in the feces, so therefore, right, it will be digestible. But even if you are using pepsin digestibility assay, these protein with knots, these polypeptides are like parts of knots like this, may actually be measured as soluble. So you say, oh, they're digestible using pepsin digestibility, but they may not be digestible to the animal. So they may be measured as pepsin digestible, but not digestible by the animal. So we started looking into this issue and say if we could reduce this level of knots within the protein. And one example, typical example, is feta meal. There's lots of disulfide bridge. So we pre-process the disulfide bridge using a protease and a reducing agent that reduces the disulfide bonds. So we use sodium sulfide, very cheap product. We produce these hydrolyzed feta meal. And to make a long story short, is we're able to improve the digestibility of feta meal considerably. The feta meal digestibility is not too bad, but we're able to increase the digestibility tremendously. And we increase the bioavailability of amino acids in the two feta meals that we test, one lower quality feta meal and one higher quality feta meal. And the product became beautiful. So really, we believe that cross-link amino acids is a pretty important thing. But in the end, right, well, how it works is that there's chemical reaction going on, and basically serine and cysteine can degrade themselves into dihydroalanine, and dihydroalanine is a glue, is a molecular glue, and it likes to bind to a bunch of molecules, including essential amino acids, and they will create these cross-link amino acids. These cross-link amino acids are not created alone, they're created within the protein chain, so they create knots, like knots in your shoelace. And we determined that with increasing processing temperature, we found this great formation of these cross-link amino acids. This work by one of my PhD students, just very recent work. We see this increase in cross-link amino acids with increasing temperature. So anything that is treated at high temperature had high risk of creating cross-link amino acids and interfering with the bioavailability of amino acid. And what we found is actually the cross-link amino acids may be an interesting quality or protein bioavailability or amino acid bioavailability indicators. So we're investing efforts now to determine if we can differentiate between ingredients of different quality using cross-link amino acid as a marker nowadays. Now, I mentioned, so there's a cross-link between amino acids, but there's also the other reaction that may affect the digestibility of protein, or at least the bioavailability of amino acids. And one is a reaction with phytic acid. As we're using cheaper ingredients, we may actually rely on protein sources that contain more phytic acids and not more anti-nutritional factors. And there may be a complex created between phytic acids, the minerals like zinc and calcium and magnesium and starch, and create these protein complex that can be a little bit lower digestibility. So we carried out a study with different rapeseed product, or Juncia meal in this specific case, and we found that in the high quality product, but with high level of phytic acids, we saw lower digestibility of protein. So we had lower quality ingredients or lower nutritional density ingredients. We had no problem with digestibility. But once we concentrated the protein, the phytic acid followed the protein and interfere with the digestion of the process. And the more sensitive amino acids were those that were more sensitive, the one that were responding the most to the decrease in digestibility, were the amino acids that were the most sensitive to this interaction with phytic, including histidine and lysine, whereas arginine was not really affected because it doesn't interact very well with phytic acid. So that made me think, it says, well, we use phytase to increase digestibility of phosphorus, and it's been shown to be very effective. But there's always a slight effect of the phytase on protein digestibility. And I think that effect may actually be used due to this undoing of these complexes. It's not completely proven, but there's some indication that, right, this phytic acid, phytase enzyme can actually increase the digestibility of protein, probably also increase the bioavailability of amino acids. It's something that needs to be further investigated. and it's cost-effective and commercially available solution. There's also protease that you can use, DSM as protease. Protease will not be that meaningful when you have a high-quality feed, a higher protein feed. It will be more marginal feed. So in this context of increase in risk, increase in price of commodities, you may seek to reduce your nutritional density of your feed to make a cheaper feed, to keep the price the same, right? Give less nutrients. Well, this is where enzymes can be of greater value. If you're producing a very, very high quality feed, you're probably not going to see an impact of enzymes. If you're producing a lower quality feed, this is where the enzymes sit. So that's what the evidence, I've seen other evidence with other companies that indicates something similar. To finish up, I'm almost leave time to questions, but using systematic approach to look at digestibility of nutrients is pretty important. And I've developed model to predict the digestibility of nutrients, for example, phosphorus, on the basis of the chemical characteristics of the ingredients. Don't think phosphorus, for example, is one single thing. It comes in part of many different molecules. So understanding the level of these different molecules is pretty important. And then we use mathematics to estimate the digestibility of these different components and the impact of things like phytase on the digestibility of these different phytic acid, for example, and the like. We've developed a model not just for carnivorous fish, but also for omnivorous fish, including Nile tilapia, and we've implemented this in commercial practice, and it found to work really well. That leads me to my final things. In the end, you develop knowledge, you develop know-how and tools. And what I've tried to do with our company, with Aqua, is actually make these tools commercially available. You may not have all the resources, all the skills, and all the modeling skills in order to make use of this. But we're developing technologies to make these tools and know-how available to feed manufacturer at a single click on cloud-based using our Aqua Feed and Aqua Farm platform. I'd be happy to give you more information if you ever want more information. I wish to thank the team at DSM and the organizers and the logistical support for this seminar. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Doctor. It was very nice topic, was a very nice presentation. A lot of information here. I hope will be useful to you all that are following us. We have many questions here. We're gonna address some and do a time limit. We're gonna answer someone that could not address here later on through email. But let's start it with the Q&A session now. Eduardo, do you have a question here?
Yes, Thiago, you have some question here. The first one is about EPA and DHA. The question is, EPA DHA is decreased in the past 10 years, and NOFIMA, the Norway, has a link, with the increasing of melanose in salmon and trout fillets. The question is, what's the best level of EPA and DHA to increase the performance of salmon and trout?
That's a good question. I have done a little bit of research on EPA and DHA in salmon and trout, but a very limited thing. Evidence from my lab, my predecessor, was finding that somewhere between 0.5 to 1% EPA plus DHA was required by salmon, probably closer to 1% to maximize performance. But that's to maximize just growth in smaller animals, but then you have an impact on product quality, on fatty acid composition of your product, which is unknown. You may have some problem like cis-melanosis or skeletal deformities or something. It may play a role, so you may need to use higher level. And the research has not been done properly on this, in my opinion. There's been very limited amount of research on optimal level of EPA. The other thing is that as you're replacing fish oil, you have to replace it with something else. So you bring other types of fatty acids. So in itself, the response may not be related to EPA and DHA, but may be related to the level of omega-6 in the diet, or 18.2 and -6, or even alpha-linolenic acid, 18.3 and -3 level. This we've seen in some marine fish species that you have high level omega-3, but it's not the right type of omega-3 in the diet. So very interesting question. Not enough work on this. There's a few good researchers, Joe Cecchini, for example, Jesse Truczynski, NOFIMA doing some work in tropical species in Malaysia, on this, but clearly not enough work given the price of these ingredients. So over the years and over the next few years, I'll try to follow up this topic and then try to contribute to that topic.
Yeah, just to continue the same topic, Dominique. The other question is about the requirement of what kind of fish have a higher requirement of omega-3, and how can you replace it? Because I think it's the link with the fish oil is decreasing the fish, the fish diet.
Well, the only practical source of EPA and DHA, and especially DHA, is fish oil or these new algae meal and algae oil, which work really, really well. I've done tests with them, with 2 sources of them, and they work really well. They're highly digestible. They perform very well. Whether the algae biomass or the algae oil works really well. But that's expensive. So in the end, yeah, you have to find out how much your animal need, how low can you go. Now, which species have the highest requirements? I found, based on my literature, cobia seemed to have very high requirement, more than 1% DHA, and they don't use EPA. They have to supply DHA, so it becomes very expensive to meet. But it's a high-value fish, and right on this. Salmon and trout are supposed to be able to elongate shorter chain fatty acids like alpha-linoleic acid coming from canola or linseed or other thing, rapeseed, anything. But you always have a small edge, small competitive advantage or something with fish oil and DHA. So even though they're able to elongate, EPA and DHA seems to be more effective, but they can make do with this. So they have a lower requirement per se compared to other species. It depends on the condition. I'm really not the expert, but there's clearly a difference between species and their ability. Now, I come from Canada. We have lots of canola oil, canola product. Actually, we don't always care about omega-3 too much, at least the 18-20. When I go to other countries, like in Southeast Asia, the omega-3 is extremely expensive, and it often drives your cost of your feed. So finding the right level of omega-3 is critical in some of the species. And frankly speaking, for carnivorous, for tropical omnivorous and carnivorous fish species, we do not have a whole lot of information so far.
Perfect. Thank you, Doctor. Precisely answered despite the scarce information we have on this topic yet, a lot to research. I'm gonna keep our conversation on alternative ingredients. And then there is a question here. I'm gonna combine 2 questions from Uriel Estrada and from Mariel Tavares. They ask about, industrially speaking, the use of insect meals as protein source in aquafeeds are profitable, and also if you have any experience in the use of insect meal and dry yeast for fish formulation, and what about inclusion of those 2 sources?
Well, insect, I mean, there's lots of companies involved in that business, lots of hype, lots of investment, but the cost is still expensive and the cost will remain high. We're talking 3,000 euro, 3,000 US dollars per ton. I've talked to a insect manufacturer that is aiming to, they operate in a low cost country and they can produce cheaper, but it's still going to be more expensive than high LT fish meal. So to me, the big hype on insect meal says, well, what is it about? Is it about cost or is it about hype and creating something new? And that's what most insect producers now are targeting. A big French company like Auchan and Carrefour or something to produce these trout that can be sold a certain way, but the cost of feed is more expensive. So I'm not a big fan of insect meal because of cost. As an ingredient itself, if it's like priced properly, why not? It can replace fish meal. There's some good indications to replace fish meal. There's some indication that it's a functional ingredient. It contains antimicrobial peptides and some components that can help with the health of animal. So it may increase disease resistance. It may be a good thing in shrimp and tilapia, where you have high mortality sometime, quite often, improve the disease resistance. So as a functional feed additive, I have nothing against it. As a major protein source, I say forget it. I mean, formulate your feed based on soy and poultry byproduct meal, meat and bone meal, right? Soy, rapeseed products and the like, corn product, right? A little bit of fish meal, right? Use it, but it's not a major thing. Same thing for yeast. Yeast has been used for decades as an ingredient. immune stimulant, some very good product, improve palatability, improve stress response and things like that. I've done it. I've done the test. Some yeast product can increase disease resistance. I've done it. I work with, I don't want to name of companies, but some good product out there. But again, it's a question of price. Do you want to pay, right, $7 or $8 a kilogram for something that you have to use at 3 or 4 or 5 different kilograms of the feed? That will add to your cost of your feed. So it's all an economical decision on what you want to do. So small level of functional ingredients, as long as the price is right, is a great thing. Yeast as a major protein source, well, if it's cheap, yes, but then there's lots of non-protein nitrogen in there, so there's a limit. So you don't want to exceed maybe 5 to 10% of the diet of these ingredients when the price is right, when it's competitive with other protein sources.
Minimum cost for salads, right?
Yeah, exactly. So,
There are also, I believe I can follow up this topic with a question bringing up to content of soy meal. So Jonathan Aponte asks, when the diets are formulated with a high content of soy meal and low content of fish meal, that could create any problems on digestibility of the feed, and also what's the recommendation of the maximum inclusion of soy meal for tilapia in this case?
Okay. My experience has been first with salmon and trout. So there's a limit of how much soy you can use, and it will create enteritis. It creates an inflammation of the intestine. Now that inflammation, I've done it experimentally, and it can create inflammation in the intestine, may not affect the performance of the animal. You can have a little bit upset gut, a little inflamed gut, and you can still grow well and things, and we've seen this in salmon and trout. They can do well. The digestibility is not the major issue. Some people have shown a reduction in fat digestibility in very high fat salmon diet, but it was not dramatic. So the use of soy product doesn't affect digestibility. It can create inflammation, which may or may not have this. In some cases, the inflammation actually increased immune response of the animal. In this case, we had a parasite, a blood parasite. We had soybean into the diet, and the trout were able to clear the blood parasite so well because they had a heightened immune response. So it's not a bad thing. In tilapia, anywhere between, depends on the cost of feed and all this, anywhere between 30 to 40 is perfectly fine for tilapia, for soy. You can even go a little bit higher than this. But from my perspective, why put your eggs in the same basket? Just mix and match different ingredients. Formulate to 30, 35% soybean, and use other ingredients. Control your quality of your product, and you can produce a good, cost-effective feed.
Perfect. Thank you, doctor. And one last question here, during the middle of time, in respect of everybody in your time, doctor. William Quevedo asks us if there is zootechnical benefits on the use of phytase silanase on fish feed, and how to use it during the process of the extrusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, all these enzymes, first of all, are, even though some of them are heat stable, cannot resist extrusion, or even the steam pelleting that is used. At least I know in Southeast Asia, it doesn't resist this, even though there's been some improvement in the stability. So it really has to be applied post-pelleting things. But we're adding supplemental oil and other supplements. So many feed manufacturers are equipped to apply those enzymes afterward. Or if you're not, you should be thinking about this. The equipment is available and not that expensive in a big scheme of things, of improving your flexibility of your feed manufacturing or formulation strategies. So that's how you apply. I'm a believer that these enzymes can be useful, but you have to have the substrate. If you're formulated with high level of animal proteins, well, maybe your phytic acid level is low and your phosphorus requirements are met, so you don't have to worry about it. So it makes sense in a context of formulating with high plant protein ingredients, high phytic acid content of your ingredients. That makes sense. Xylanase and all this will increase the digestibility of energy. Now, whether that energy, that sugar release, will be useful to the animal or not is very much a question. What I've seen, though, is that these enzymes, both phytase, xylanase, and protease, are generally useful in low quality feed. So when you're pushing the envelope, you're really decreasing your quality of your feed, you're using lower quality ingredients, lower nutritional specs, you can see a beneficial impact. If you formulate to high spec, forget about it, it's not that useful. Unless you want to change the fecal characteristics. What we found is that when we added an enzyme mix to soybean meal-based diet, we could actually make the fecal material very soluble, very breakable. And that may be a good thing when you want to break out the waste. But if you're operating within a recirculation system, maybe you want your waste to be very stable. So it really depends on the end use of your thing. The proof of the pudding is in eating. You have to test it and see whether it makes sense for you within your conditions, your species, your clients' operating conditions, and all this. There's no simple solution to that question.
Thiago, just to complement it's the questions about enzyme, from our side, from DSM, usually, as Dominique told us, use the liquid enzymes to extrude the feed. You apply it post-pellet, and the enzyme is in the form of liquid, so it's easy, not so hard to apply. As Dominique told us, it's impossible to survive in the process of extruder. But for pelletized feeding, for shrimp, it's possible to use the granulate because the temperature is not so high. You have some evidence that the enzymes can survive, for the 90 degrees and post-pellet condition. You can use it as a granulate enzyme too.
Yeah, so I mean, every formulation and every processing, so you have to test whether it works in your condition. I know in Indonesia and things, they were actually, a lot of the enzyme activity was knocked down. So yeah. It really depends on the condition, the temperature, the post-drying temperature, and the like. But you have to try it, find out what works for you.
That's right. Perfect. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Eduardo. On this side, there is a lot yet to be done. Yet we've been walking this path for some time already and see how the industry can adapt it to the use of enzyme, how to make it effective, and also how the results in the farms are very surprisingly good. Like when you see fish growing better, using better the nutrients of the feed, and also effects on the water quality and the total yield of the production. So much to do here, and it's really nice to bring the topic, and so people can just consider and open their minds to another possibility to work in different feeds, with different feed ingredients and different feed formulation types.
Open mind is the word.
Nice. Thank you, Doctor.
My pleasure.
I'd like to, once again, we appreciate your presence here very much, sharing knowledge with us. We're looking forward to have you here once again and bringing another relevant topic to the whole industry, bringing relevant information. And so thank you once again for the exhibition, and hope to see you all again soon on another webinar, DSM Webinar Series.
Thank you.